And now we're going to begin on Daf Nun Amud Beis and study the suffix of Rabbi Loza. L'divrei ha'omer, according to the Mandiyom, who says par of Yom Kippurim. The par shel Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim is a korban yachid. Says Rabbi Loza, I have the following suffix: osa tmura, o eno osa tmura. If let's say you have a behemas kodesh that was designated b'kedusha saguf as a zevach, I have a behemas chulin, and now I do a tmura, and I try to transfer the kedusha from the zevach, which is kedusha saguf, over to the chulin. So the law is that he can't do such a thing. He cannot undermine and remove the status of the first korban, the zevach, but yet the second one, which is called tmura, also has a kedusha. We're going to see the differences between the original and the tmura later on. And now the question is, what happens in a case of a Kohen Gadol who set aside a par for a chatos on Yom HaKippurim? Is it a korban yachid? And a korban yachid is oset tmura, or eno oset tmura, which means that it might be a korban tzibur. Lav michlal to ikal amad yom tzibur. It's against Rav, who says there's no such thing as a Tana who would classify paro shel par chata shel Yom shel Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim as a korban tzibur. Here you see that Rabbi Lazar was not sure what the status of, and he raised the possibility that eno osa tmura. And why can't it make a tmura? Because he holds that it's that the par Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur has the status of a korban tzibur, and there's no tmura in the case of a korban tzibur. The Gemara answers low. No, you shouldn't make that diuk from the words of Rabbi Lazar that somebody would hold that par Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur is a korban tzibur, but rather michlal deikal amandi omar dishutfim. That what Rabbi Lazar vacillated about is that perhaps we have to define and classify the paro shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim as a korban shutfim, and a korban shutfim doesn't have a din of tmura, just like a korban tzibur doesn't. Gufa, boy, Rabbi Lazar. Let's go back to the suffix of Rabbi Lazar. L'divrei, according to Rabbi Meir, who holds ha'omer par b'Yom Kippurim, the par the Kohen Gadol is a korban yachid, osa tmura and osa tmura. My komi biasly. The Gemara wants to know, what is the nature of this vacillation? It's pashut that since the brothers of the Kohen Gadol, meaning the Echav HaKohanim, will gain and achieve a kapara through this par, certainly it's a korban shutfim and it cannot create tmura. So this par for sure cannot create a tmura. Why? How does Rabbi Lazar raise a suffix about this and possibly holding that there would be tmura in parashal Kohen Gadol? So the Gemara answers, here's the nature of Rabbi Lazar's vacillation is suffix. What determines the law of tmura and classifies it either as a yachid and it does make a tmura, or not so and it doesn't make a tmura? Ibasa magdish az linan. Does it depend upon who is magdish the korban? If a yachid was magdish the korban and then he was meimir, and he said about a behemas chulin arehi tmuras korban, then the tmura would be chal. But if rabim hikdishu, then afterwards, if there's somebody who does a tmura, and he says on this behemas chulin it should be tmuras korban zeh, then lo chala tmura. And this par of Kohen Gadol, hikdisho yachid, it's only the Kohen Gadol who brings it from his own funds. He's the one who's magdish it. There's no shutfis here in the magdish. There's only one magdish, and if there's only one magdish, then it's osa tmura. But ibasa miskaper as linan. What shall we say? That tmura is determined not by the magdish, but by the miskaper. And here, in the case of partial Kohen Gadol, we have many miskaprim, and therefore Eino Osa Tmura. And this par, which has, as we said before, the kapar for all the Kohanim, then there's no chalos Tmura, the Tmura is ineffective. So the Gemara says, if that's the way you're analyzing the suffix or Abelazar, as to whether or not Basar Magdish or Basar Miskaper Azlinon, Pshita de Basar Miskaper Azlinon, there's no question that the law of Tmura depends on the Miskaper, and therefore, hence, Paro Shel Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim would not be subject to Tmura. The Omer Rabbi Yavo, Omer Rabbi Yochanan, there are three cases where somebody digs into his pocket in order to facilitate his friend to be Makayim his friend's chova. For example, let's say a person is a nazi, and now he has to bring the karbanos of a nazi. He doesn't have the funds, so Ruvain shells out, and he's mafresh the karbanos on behalf of Shimon the nazi. In such a case, says Rabbi Yochanan, that if this behemoth that Reuven was magdish on behalf of Shimon had a mum fell in it, and therefore you cannot bring a behemoth bal mum onto the mizbeach. So now what you do is you want to be poded. Now the halacha is in Vayikra Chav Zayin, v'im ga'ol yigalenu v'yasaf chamishaso al erkecha al akecha, that you have to add a 20% tax, so to speak, on a pidyon on top of the carrot. So principal plus 20%. However, if the miskaper is poder, then he doesn't add a chomish. And this is derived from the pasuk there in Vayikra Chav Zayin. It says v'im ha-magdish yigal. So it all depends on the magdish. So as far as the tosefes of chamishis, in the case of pidyon, after it became a balmum, here everything depends upon the mafresh, meaning Ruvain, who designated his carbon on behalf of Shimon, he's going to have to pay the magdish yigal the yosef chamishis. Then we have number two, hamiskaper osa tmura. If, let's say, Ruvain shells out to buy a carbon on behalf of Shimon, Shimon is the miskaper, then he can create tmura. The magdish, otherwise known as the mafresh, he cannot make tmura. Why? Because he's not considered the bala carbon. Only the miskaper is considered the bala carbon. And we have a principle, ein adam yachal lahamer carbon shalachere b'gemar and tmura. And we see clearly here that in terms of who can make a tmura and who cannot create a tmura, it all depends upon the miskaper. So it couldn't be that Rabbi Elazar was vacillating about that. And number three, Atorem Shelo al shel chaveru, Ruvain takes his own fruits, his own grains, and he's mafresh on behalf of Shimon who's chayav in truma or in maser, is tovas hanoshalo. The one, Ruvain, who is mafresh the truma from his own pocket, his own privately owned tvua, he gets the tovas hanoah. He can decide which kohen this truma should be given to, and that's based on a pasuk in Dvarim, in Parshas Kitetzi. It says Kisechalel aseres kol masar tvuascha v'nasato la Levi. And we see that the sinus maser here is dependent upon the one who is mafresh the tmura. In any event, as far as tmura is concerned, we see clearly that whether or not there could be a tmura that's valid depends upon the miskaper. Now, this partial Kohen Gadol is miskaper bo rabim, well, the Kohanim are miskaper, then it should be absolutely poshut that there's no possibility of creating tmura, because the entire Sheva Kahuna are the miskaprim here. And how could it be that Rabbi Elazar vacillated about this? The Gemara answers, Li'olam, as far as Tmur is concerned, Pshitale, the Basam miskapra as linon. Rabbi Elazar had no doubt about it that as far as Tmur is concerned, we look at the miskaper, and only the miskaper could create Tmura. And if there are many miskaprim, then there's no possibility of tmura. That becomes a carbon of shutfim. But Hachi Kami Boile, here's where Rebbe Lazar was in doubt. Echav HaKohanim, what's the status of the kapara? After all, the Kohen Gadol is bringing his own par, and the Kohanim are being miskapre. How do we define it? Bikvi Utsa miskapre. They have a kvius gebura as far as kapara is concerned, and they are the miskaprim. They are number one miskaprim, and therefore this par has, so to speak, a bilus of all the Kohanim. Each one, all of them together, as a shevet have a chelek and a kinyan in this par. And therefore, the tmura here would be considered a chata shutfin, and it doesn't lend itself to tmura. The tmura is not valid. O dilma, shall we say, bikufya miskapre, that really the miskaper is the Kohen Gadol himself. It's pure yachid. But there's a loch of greira, of agav, meaning agav the Kohen Gadol, the Kohanim, Echav HaKohanim also achieve kapara. But the Bailim and the miskaper is none other than the Kohen Gadol himself. This was the suffix of Rabbi Loza. Tashma. Now let's try to be poshet his suffix from a brisa. Chomer bezevach. Mivitmura. Now this brisa is comparing and contrasting a carbon, a behemoth that was sanctified. It was a tamim. It was not a balmum. It was sanctified as kedushas haguf zevach, as opposed to the tmura when he effectuated a tmura on the behemoth chulin. And we have a chumra in the zevach as opposed to the tmura. The opposite is also true. The chomer but tmura miba zevach, and there's a certain chumra in tmura that doesn't apply to zevach. So let's go through this. The Brisa explains. Chomer bezevach mi be tmura shazevach noeg biyochid kibet sibur. There's no difference between a carbon yochid and a carbon sibur. In both cases, you could be magdish a carbon and designate this behema as kedushas haguf and doches hashabbos satuma, and an original zevach in some cases will override the Shabbos and the Tumah. And not only that, but Otsa Tmura. A Zevach can make a Tmura. We're going to soon see that a Tmura cannot make another Tmura. Masha Enke b'Tmura. Number one, Tmura doesn't apply to a carbon tzibur. Number two, it doesn't override Shabbos and Tumah. It itself can be brought on the Mizbeach, but it doesn't have a Zman Kavua lehakravasa, and you cannot take a Tmura and make another Tmura out of the first Tmura. So those are the three chumras of a Zevach vis-a-vis Tmura. But Chomer b'Tmura b'Zevach, what is the chumra of Tmura that doesn't apply to a Zevach? Shatmura chalalav al bal mum kavua. Even if you have a balas mum, a behema balas mum, you can still make it into a tmura and create a kedushas haguf. Again, you can't bring it on the mizbeach because it's a bal mum, but rather he's going to have to be poda it when it's a balas mum, and there's always going to be vestige in a pigeon of a bal mum of the original kedushas haguf. How does the original Kedushas Haguf still haunt us, so to speak? It's still in the shadows. And a yotza lechulin ligazes v'le'ovid. You're allowed to eat it after the pigeon, but you're not allowed to do work with it, and you're not allowed to shear its wool. Mashenki b'zevach. If let's say you had a balas mum, and you designated and were magdish this bal mum as a zevach, there's no Kedushas Haguf. And therefore, if you repoda it, it's only got a kedushas damim, and you'd be allowed to take off the giza and enjoy the benefit of the giza. You're allowed to work with it. So the Gemara now wants to analyze this brisa. Hi zevach, this zevach that's mentioned here in the brisa, hechi damim. What's the case of a zevach? Ilema di yachid mi dachi Shabbos v'tumah. You're going to have to find a very unique case of a zevach of a yachid that's docha Shabbos and docha Tumah. Elad tzibur, it can't be talking about a korban tzibur here, the zevach, because mi osa tmura. It says that a zevach is osa tmura, and that's not true in a korban tzibur. Elalav, by process of elimination, we do our Sherlock Holmes detective work. It must be that this zevach is none other than the par kohen gadol shel Yom Kippurim, which is a chatos, and therefore the Brisa assumes that it is no heges even bit tzibur. And v'dochas hashavas esatuma. Why is this korban yachid of a par chatas shel Yom Kippurim to kohen gadol b'Yom Kippurim? Why is it dochas Shabbos and Tuma the Kvil Azman? As we established earlier, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yaakov, etc., that if it has a time urgency, then despite the fact that this korban yachid overrides Shabbos. The Osa Tmura, the korban yachid who. It's the sheet of Rabbi Meir that the status of Par Shel Yom Kippurim and Kohen Gadol is that of a korban yachid, and nevertheless, Osa Tmura. That's what it says here in the Bryce. So you see clearly that a Par Shel Yom Kippurim, although it's a korban yachid, because it's a korban yachid, it's Osa Tmura, and that would be an answer to the suffix of Rabbi Eliezer. And even though in Tmur we go by some miskaper, and here the miskaperim are the rabbim of the kohanim, nevertheless, bekufya miskaper. The Gemara rejects it. Omer Rav Sheshes lo. You don't have to interpret the Brisa that the Brisa is talking about a case of a par kohen gadol b'Yom Kippurim, but rather we can interpret it as Elo Shel Aaron. And in the case of Elo Shel Aaron, the aisle that the Kohen Gadol brings from his own pocket as an Ola on Yom Kippurim, the Torah says, "B'zos Yovo Aaron HaKodesh B'par Ben B'kol Chatos," the aisle Ola, and here there's no kapara for the Shevet Kahuna. This is purely the private aisle and Ola of the Kohen Gadol. Now, the Ola, as a general rule, can be an Olas Tzibur and a Docha Shabbos V'Tumah, because that's man kavua. And in the case of Elo Shel Kohen Gadol, it's Docha Shabbos, Docha Yom Kippur, and it's Docha Tumah, it's mano kavua, it's got to be brought on Yom Kippur. And why is it Osa Tmura? That's because the korban yochanan, the only miskaper is the Kohen Gadol. And the Tmura, in such a case, would be brought as an Ola, and it's not Docha Shabbos or Tumah. And it cannot create another Tmura. So in other words, we still have room for the suffix as far as the Par Kohen Gadol, the Yom Kippurim, according to the Rabbi Meir holds it's a korban yachid. Does it create Tmura? Does it not? And our brisa that we're studying here is referring not to the Par Shel Kohen Gadol, but rather to the Ayel Shel Kohen, where clearly there's no other Bailim, there's no other Miskaprim other than the Kohen Gadol. The Gemara wants to prove this by saying, Hachinami Mistabra, it's logical to accept Rav Shesh's interpretation that the Zevach in this brisa is the Ayel of the Kohen Gadol and not the Par. The Salkadat, the Paro, if you're going to raise the possibility that the Zevach in this brisa is referring to the Par of the Kohen Gadol, and the brisa is saying Tmurasa de Par and Shabbos V'Tumah Hudelo Dochia Ha B'Chol Makriv Karva Ha Tmuras Chatas Misa Azla. The brisa indicates clearly that although we cannot be makriv this zevach on Shabbos and B'Tumah, but nevertheless, if it would have been a weekday, then we would bring this karma, this tmura. So tmura doesn't have the power to be docha Shabbos and Tumah, but does have the kedusha guf to be brought on the mizbeach. Now that's impossible. Why? because Tmuras Chatos is included in the Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. There are 5 Chatos HaMesos included in the Chatos HaMesos, and one of them is Tmuras Chatos. The Tmuras Chatos is Lemisa. There's no Akrava. So we must be talking about an Ola, because in Tmuras Ola, there is Hakrava. There's no Hakrava in the Tmuras Chatos. So that would support Rav Sheshes that this Bryce is referring not to the par lechatos of the Kohen Gadol, but rather the ayoli olam. Bar rejects it slowly. Olam, paro. We're really talking in this Bryce when it says zevach about the paro shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim. Umay tmura. Now you're asking it's a chatos, and there's no such thing as a tmuras chatos that is brought on the mizbeach. And the Brisa says the Tmura is not brought on Shabbos or Betuma, implying that on Chol it would be brought. No. That's not a reference to the Tmura of this particular par, which is a Tmuras Chatos. And that's not Kreva, B'chol, even B'chol, but rather L'Shem Tmura. Anything that has the status or the name of a Tmura. In other words, anything that in other zvachim, other than this par, which is a chatos, would be subject and lend itself to tmura. And the Bryce is telling me that the din of par Kohen Gadol shel Yom Kippurim is chamur from the din of a carbon that has a shame tmura. And that means that the par shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim is docha Shabbos and Tumah, whereas a shame tmura, even though he's makav b'chol, but it could not override the Shabbos or Tumah. So the Gemara asks the Hachi, if you're telling me that when it says Tmura in the Brisa, it's not the Tmura of that Zevach that's being discussed in the Brisa, but rather it's the shame Tmura. So why did Rav Sheshes go into this Dochak to interpret that when the Brisa says Zevach, it's referring to a specific carbon, and therefore he was forced willy-nilly to interpret that the kavanah, the intention of the Brisa was for par Kohen Gadol shel Yom Kippurim, or to the Isle of Kohen Gadol Yom Kippurim. It's as possible that Zevach in this Brisa, Nami, not talking about a specific carbon, but rather Shem Zevach, something that has a Shem Zevach. Those carbonos that he was magdishit milachat chila, and that has a Shem Zevach. The Brisa wants to tell me that yesh dvarim shebahem din karbonos hukdishu v'tchila chamor midin karbonos shehem v'tmura shekarbonos hukdishu v'tchila yesh mehem shenoagim b'yachid, yesh mehem shenoagim b'tzibur, yesh mehem shedochim v'sashavos v'tuma. Like for example, a carbon tzibur or a carbon yachid shesmanu kavua, and yesh mehem ta'osim tmura, like a carbon yachid. So the more answers no. Shem zevach lo k'tan. Right, the Brisa, the Tana of this Brisa did not refer to a Shem Zevach. He's talking about a Zevach Echad, a specific Zevach, whether it be Par Kohen Gadol shel Yom Kippurim or Ayal Kohen Gadol shel Yom Kippurim, as we said earlier. And the Gemara says, "Mimai, how do I know that the Brisa is not referring to Shem Zevach? Midaktani, because it says in the Sefer of the Brisa, Chomer bitmura shatmura chala al bal mum kavua. Vienna yotza lechulin ligazes belay of it. Only you could eat it. And in a zevach, there's no kedusha guf chal on a balas mum. Ishal kedaikach my zevach. And if you could entertain the possibility that when the Brisa uses the word zevach, it's a shem zevach, and it comes out that if you're going to say shem zevach, that which the Brisa said that there's no carbon kadosh mitchila when it's a bal mum kavua, that's a mistake, because if you're talking about shem zevach, I could show you within the constellation of a zevach a carbon that you could be magdashid even if it's a bal mum. And here we turn to Dafnan Aleph, and that is bechar. That's the first vlad that comes out of the rechem imo, or maser behema. You have 10 behemos, and the 10th, after you count them, is a maser behema. the cholin al bal mum kavua, and these would be chal even on a bal mum. A bechar is kodesh mirechem imo, and it doesn't matter whether it's a tam or a bal mum, because the kedusha is not a result of Maisa Hegdish, but rather by the fact that it is kadosh mirechem imo. And Maisa Behema, the Torah says, lo yevaker ben tov l'ra, vayikra chav zayin, meaning whether or not it's asiri tomim or it's an asiri balmum, there's a chalos kedushas mas. The cholam al balmum, the ein yotzin lechumra, lechulin, legamre, ligazes v'liyevad. So therefore, it cannot be that Shem Zevach, Ella, Vadai, no doubt, Shem Zevach lo ketani. The Tan is not using a Shem Zevach, right? He's talking about a par kohen gadol b'yom kippurim or an aisle kohen gadol b'yom kippurim, and the Tana says that there are dvarim shebahem din zevach zeh chamur mi din shem tmura, and there are dvarim that the din shem tmura is chamur mi din zevach zeh. So the Gemara asks, "Umayshna, what's the difference in tmura and the difference between tmura and zevach? Why is it that in zevach you're not willing to say shem zevach, but tmura you say shem tmura? And therefore the Tana, when he said zevach and tmura, he meant it in two different ways. Zevach he meant to say a specific korban, right? The kohen gadol of Yomi, and tmura he meant to say in a more generic sense shem tmura. And the Gemara answers tmura. The Tana uses the shem tmura achasi. All the tmuras of all the karbanos are equal in all the dinim that were mentioned here, enumerated in the brisa by the Tana. And kulam einam sheyachos b'karban tzibur v'ein karbanos docha Shabbos utmura, and therefore shem tmura achas and also tmura, and kedushasam chalal balei mumim. And after pidyon of the tmura, it's also begizav avod. But zevach, the Tana could not have meant shem zevach, as if to say it applies to all karbanos, because the brisa says that a zevach after pidyon, when it became a balmum, is muta begiza ve'avoda. That's not true. Ika bechar v'ika maser. In these cases, even though they yotzin lechulin through pidyon, but nevertheless they are not muta begiza v'avod. They're also begiza v'avod. Therefore, the Tana was specific when he used the term zevach, a specific zevach, the par or the aisle of the kohen gadol on Yom Kippurim, and after pidyon yotzin lechulin, and then muta even begiza v'avod. So the Gemara now comes back to Rav Sheshes, who said the brisa is referring to Elo Shel Aaron. Rav Sheshes Ademukim law, until he says that the zevach in the brisa is Be'elu Shel Aaron Lukma be Pesach, the Dochas HaShabbos Dochas HaTumah Oset Tmura, because the carbon Yachidhu. Why does he have to stretch his arm out all the way to Elo Shel Aaron? And the answer is Kasavar, because he holds, meaning Rav Sheshes holds, like Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda in Psachim Daf Tzadi Aleph goes on record as saying, "Ein shoftin on Pesach ala yochid." You can only shech the Korban Pesach if you have a chabura, and therefore the Korban Pesach by definition is a Korban HaShutfim, and it cannot create a Tmura like other Korbanos of Shutfim. They cannot create a Tmura, and therefore it's impossible to say that the Brisa is referring to a Korban Pesach. The Nukme, the Gemara asks, bit Pesach Sheni, which is a Pesach that's brought even for a Yachid, and it creates Tmura. Gemara answers, Midachi Tuma, but Pesach Sheni does not override Tuma, such that we can interpret this brisa that the Zevach in this brisa is referring to Pesach Sheni. And Ladas Chachamim, later on, we'll see that it's not Doche Tuma. This is where we're going to stop for the day. Have a great